For 3 years, nobody at Forward Operating Base Sentinel knew that the woman scrubbing blood off surgical tables had once held a scalpel steadier than any surgeon in the Navy. Dr. Natasha Kline had become a ghost long before she ever set foot in the Afghan desert. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. At 36, she moved through the medical bay with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned that survival meant silence. Her dark hair, streaked with premature gray, stayed tucked beneath a faded surgical cap that had seen better days. The other corpsmen called her the Librarian behind her back, a reference to her habit of reading outdated medical journals during breaks and her unnerving ability to diagnose complications before the attending physicians noticed anything wrong. What they didn't know was that Natasha Kline had once been Commander Natasha Reeves, the youngest chief of trauma surgery at Naval Medical Center Portsmouth. 7 years ago, she had pioneered revolutionary battlefield triage techniques that saved dozens of lives during Operation Enduring Flame. Her research on rapid hemorrhage control had been adopted across all branches of military medicine, making her a rising star in naval healthcare. Then came the night that destroyed everything. Lieutenant Commander Gerald Hutchins, her department head and supposed mentor, had been selling experimental medications to black market dealers. Drugs meant for wounded Marines ended up in the hands of insurgents and criminal networks. When 3 soldiers died from contaminated supplies, the investigation needed a scapegoat. Hutchins had decades of political connections and a brother-in-law on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Natasha had competence, integrity, and absolutely no protection. Falsified inventory records painted her as the negligent supervisor who'd ignored security protocols. Manufactured testimony from coerced witnesses described her as reckless and ambitious, willing to cut corners for career advancement. The medical board hearing lasted 4 days. By the end, Commander Natasha Reeves was stripped of her commission, her medical license suspended indefinitely, and her reputation demolished beyond repair. Only Rear Admiral Patricia Thornwood, her former instructor at the Uniformed Services University, believed in her innocence. But Thornwood's reassignment to NATO command came 48 hours before she could testify. Hutchins's network of corrupt officials buried the truth beneath mountains of procedural paperwork and institutional protection. Now, 7 years later, Natasha existed in the margins of the profession she devoted her life to mastering. She'd legally changed her surname, let her credentials lapse, and disappeared into the anonymity of enlisted medical support staff. Every bandage she rolled, every instrument tray she sterilized, every wound she cleaned under someone else's supervision was both agony and sanctuary, close enough to touch the work she loved. Forever barred from practicing it, her quarters consisted of a converted shipping container on the eastern edge of FOB Sentinel, wedged between the ammunition depot and a row of broken generators waiting for parts that would never arrive. Inside, beneath a military-issue cot that sagged in the middle, sat a small lockbox containing 3 items: a tarnished commander's insignia, a photograph of her standing in surgical scrubs beside a young Marine whose life she'd saved, and a handwritten letter from Corpsman First Class Daniel Ortega. The letter, written in Daniel's careful block printing, had arrived 2 days before the contaminated medication incident that killed him. "Commander, whatever happens with this investigation, I want you to know we all trust you completely. You're the best surgeon any of us have ever worked with. You taught me that medicine isn't about glory, it's about being there when it matters most. Semper Fi, Ortega. Every morning at 0430, Natasha ran the perimeter of FOB Sentinel in darkness. Her boots traced the same path they'd followed for 3 years. The physical pain of exertion drowning out the emotional ache of 3 Deaths that should never have happened, and a truth buried beneath layers of institutional corruption. She worked the night shift in the trauma bay, a position nobody else wanted. The hours between midnight and dawn brought the worst cases, casualties too critical to wait for morning, emergencies that tested even experienced surgeons. Natasha cleaned, observed, and occasionally assisted when the medical officers were overwhelmed. She never offered opinions, never questioned decisions, never drew attention to herself. The medical staff treated her with professional distance. To them, she was just another support technician, competent but unremarkable. They had no idea that she mentally reviewed every procedure, noting inefficiencies and tactical errors that she could never voice. They didn't know she spent her off-duty hours studying advances in trauma medicine, maintaining skills she might never use again. Staff Sergeant Tyler Brennan, the senior enlisted medic, was one of the few people who treated her as more than invisible labor. Brennan had 20 years of field experience and an instinct for reading people that made him an exceptional leader. He'd noticed that Kline understood combat medicine better than technicians with twice her documented training, though he never asked why. Kline, Brennan's voice carried across the supply room where Natasha was inventorying surgical packs. "We've got a situation developing. SEAL team dispatching to our location within the hour. Command wants the trauma bay prepped for potential mass casualty." Natasha's hands stilled on the gauze rolls she'd been counting. Navy SEALs meant high-risk operations and the kind of catastrophic injuries that pushed medical teams to their absolute limits. Working this close to elite operators was dangerous for someone trying to stay. Invisible SEALs had a way of noticing details that others missed. "Understood, Sergeant," she replied, keeping her voice level despite the surge of anticipation. "Full trauma protocols or standard combat readiness." Brennan studied her with an expression that suggested he was filing away her immediate grasp of the distinction. "Full trauma. Intelligence indicates they're walking into a hornet's nest. We need to be ready for anything." As Brennan walked away, Natasha allowed herself one moment of the old feeling, the electric anticipation of preparing for critical cases. The sharp focus that came with knowing lives might depend on split-second decisions. For 3 years, she'd been relegated to observer status, watching others practice the medicine she'd mastered. Tonight might bring her closer to real trauma surgery than she'd been since her fall from grace. She had no idea that the arriving SEAL team would include Lieutenant Jackson Mercer, an operator whose arrogance matched his skill and whose contempt for support personnel was legendary throughout Special Operations Command. She didn't know that his casual cruelty would escalate into something far more dangerous, a medical crisis that would shatter her carefully constructed invisibility and force her to choose between maintaining her cover and saving a life. The hook was already being set, though she wouldn't recognize it for hours. As Natasha methodically prepared the trauma bay, checking equipment and positioning supplies with unconscious precision that came from thousands of emergency surgeries, she had no idea that her past was about to collide with her present in the most public and irreversible way possible. The ghost in surgical scrubs was about to discover that some skills refused to stay buried, especially when death itself came calling. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Black Hawks thundered into FOB Sentinel at 2,130 hours, their rotor wash sending clouds of desert sand swirling across the landing zone. Natasha watched from the trauma bay entrance as 12 figures emerged. From the aircraft Navy SEALs moving with the lethal efficiency of apex predators returning to base. Lieutenant Jackson Mercer led the team with the kind of swagger that announced his presence before he spoke a word. At 32, he was everything the Navy recruitment posters promised: chiseled features, broad shoulders, and the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. His family's political connections ran deep. His father was a retired 3-star admiral. His uncle chaired the Senate Armed Services Committee, and his older brother worked as a senior Pentagon official. Jackson had coasted through Bud's training on natural athleticism and family influence, earning his trident without ever developing the humility that usually came with SEAL selection. To him, the world divided into 2 categories: operators like himself, and everyone else who existed to support operators like himself. "Listen up," Mercer's voice carried across the medical bay as his team filed in for mandatory post-mission medical checks. "We've got 48 hours before the next op, so let's make this quick. I don't want to spend my downtime getting poked by corpsmen who barely passed high school biology." Laughter rippled through his team. The easy camaraderie of men who'd learned to echo their leaders' attitudes. Senior Chief Petty Officer Raymond Torres, Mercer's second-in-command, shot the medical staff an apologetic look but said nothing. Torres had worked with enough support personnel to understand their value, but contradicting Mercer in front of the team wasn't worth the political fallout. Staff Sergeant Brennan stepped forward, his weathered face betraying no reaction to Mercer's insult. "Lieutenant, we'll process your team efficiently. Standard combat return protocol vitals, injury assessment, documentation. Should take 30 minutes per man." 30 minutes? Mercer's eyebrows rose in exaggerated disbelief. "Christ, Brennan, we've been shot at by actual enemies who moved faster than your medical staff. How about we speed this up? My guys need food and rack time, not bureaucratic nonsense from glorified orderlies." Natasha kept her eyes down, organizing instrument trays with mechanical precision. She'd encountered Mercer's type before: officers who confused privilege with competence, who measured their worth by how many people they could diminish. The military was full of them, protected by connections and enabled by systems that valued hierarchy over accountability. "We follow protocol, Lieutenant," Brennan replied evenly. "Your men's health is our priority, not convenience." Mercer's expression hardened, and Natasha recognized the shift from casual condescension to something more calculated. He was the kind of leader who tested boundaries constantly, pushing to see how much disrespect he could get away with. "My men's health is fine, Sergeant. We're trained to operate in conditions that would kill most of the soft bodies on this base. But if you insist on playing doctor," he gestured dismissively toward the examination areas, "let's get this theater over with." As the SEALs moved through their medical screenings, Mercer's commentary continued. He made jokes about the nursemaids checking blood pressure, questioned whether the corpsmen knew the difference between a bandage and a tourniquet, and loudly wondered if any of the medical staff had ever seen real combat or just the inside of textbooks. Natasha worked in the background, restocking supplies and maintaining equipment. Her presence barely registered to Mercer and his team, just another faceless support person in generic scrubs, unworthy of acknowledgement or basic courtesy. "Hey, you!" Mercer's voice cut through the ambient noise of the medical bay. Natasha looked up to find him pointing directly at her. "You're the one they call the Librarian, right? The supply tech who thinks she understands medicine?" The trauma bay went quiet. Every corpsman, every SEAL, every person in the space turned to watch. Natasha felt the familiar ice forming in her stomach, the sensation of being targeted by someone who enjoyed having an audience for cruelty. "I'm a medical technician." "Sir," she replied quietly, keeping her tone neutral and her eyes respectfully lowered. "Medical technician," Mercer repeated, tasting the words like they were spoiled. "That's a fancy way of saying you carry bedpans and count gauze pads, right? But Brennan tells me you ask a lot of questions about trauma procedures. Trying to educate yourself beyond your station?" Natasha's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "I believe in understanding the work I support, sir." "How noble." Mercer's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Let me explain something about how this works, sweetheart. There's a reason I'm an officer and you're enlisted. There's a reason I'm a SEAL and you're a tech. Some people are born to lead, to fight, to operate at levels most can't comprehend. Others, ... He gestured vaguely in her direction. Others are born to fetch supplies and stay out of the way when real warriors are working. Senior Chief Torres shifted uncomfortably. Lieutenant, maybe we should. I'm educating our support staff, Senior Chief, Mercer interrupted smoothly. Making sure everyone understands their role in the ecosystem. You don't see me trying to perform surgery, right? Because I know my lane. I'd just like our medical staff to know theirs. The words landed like physical blows. Natasha had endured 7 years of similar dismissals, but somehow Mercer's casual cruelty cut deeper than usual. Perhaps because she stood in a trauma bay, the environment where she'd once commanded respect and saved lives. Perhaps because his arrogance reminded her too much of Gerald Hutchins, the man who destroyed her career while wearing the same expression of entitled superiority. Yes. Sir, she replied, the words barely audible. Good. Glad we understand each other. Mercer turned back to his team, already dismissing her from his attention. All right, let's wrap this medical theater up. We've got 48 hours before we go back outside the wire, and I plan to spend them anywhere but here. As Mercer and his team departed, the trauma bay slowly returned to normal operations. But Staff Sergeant Brennan noticed the way Natasha's hands trembled slightly as she organized supplies. The tightness around her eyes that suggested she was fighting to maintain composure. Kline, Brennan said quietly, approaching her workstation. You don't have to take that kind of treatment from anyone. Mercer's an ass with a daddy who shields him from consequences, but that doesn't make his behavior acceptable. Natasha shook her head without looking up. It's not worth making an issue, Sergeant. I've heard worse. That's not the point. Brennan's voice carried an edge of protective anger. Mercer thinks his trident and family connections give him the right to treat people like they're beneath him. Someone needs to remind him that respect goes both ways. As they spoke, neither noticed Lieutenant Commander Sarah Whitmore observing from the medical bay entrance. Whitmore was the senior physician on base, a trauma surgeon with 15 years of field experience and a reputation for not tolerating nonsense from anyone. Regardless of rank or special operations credentials, she'd witnessed Mercer's entire performance, and something about it had triggered her professional instincts. More specifically, something about Kline's reaction, the way the technician had absorbed the insults with a familiarity that suggested deep experience with institutional mistreatment, and the way her eyes had briefly flashed with something that looked less like hurt and more like recognition. Whitmore made a mental note to review Kline's personnel file. Something about the quiet technician didn't add up. And after 2 decades in military medicine, Sarah Whitmore had learned to trust her instincts about people who seemed simultaneously too competent and too invisible. As the night shift settled into routine operations, Natasha returned to her quarters and opened the lockbox beneath her cot. She stared at Daniel Ortega's letter, his words about being there when it mattered most echoing in her mind. Mercer's cruelty had awakened something. She'd worked hard to suppress the burning anger at a system that protected men like him while destroying people like her. The frustration of possessing skills that could save lives while being relegated to counting supplies and cleaning equipment. She closed the box and tried to sleep, but her dreams were filled with operating rooms and emergencies. With the feeling of a scalpel in her hand and the absolute clarity that came with making life or death decisions, tomorrow would bring new opportunities for Mercer to demonstrate his character. And though Natasha couldn't know it yet, the stage was being set for a confrontation that would test everything she'd learned about survival, silence, and the cost of staying invisible when lives hung in the balance. The ghost in surgical scrubs was about to discover that some truths demanded to be heard, especially when death came calling for one of the men who'd treated her like she was nothing. The 48-hour window before Mercer's next operation became a masterclass in systematic degradation. What started as casual dismissiveness evolved into calculated humiliation. Each incident carefully designed to remind support personnel of their place in the hierarchy. Day 1 began with Mercer's team requisitioning medical supplies for their mission prep. Standard procedure called for medical staff to review requests and ensure proper allocation of limited resources. Natasha was assigned to process the SEAL team's supply request. A routine task that should have taken 15 minutes. Mercer turned it into theater. Well, he announced loudly as he entered the supply room, his team filing in behind him. They've assigned the Librarian to handle our request. This should be entertaining. Natasha kept her eyes on the requisition form, noting the items listed: combat gauze, tourniquets, hemostatic agents, 4 fluids, and a specialized chest seal that was in critically short supply. The request was reasonable except for one item. Mercer had requisitioned 6 units of fresh frozen plasma, a resource so scarce that protocol required physician approval for anything beyond emergency use. Lieutenant, the FFP requires Commander Whitmore's authorization, Natasha said quietly, keeping her tone professional. Everything else is approved and ready for pickup. Mercer leaned against the supply cage, his posture deliberately casual, but his eyes calculating. Here's the thing, sweetheart. I don't need a supply clerk telling me what requires authorization. We're going outside the wire into hostile territory. If one of my guys takes a round and needs plasma, I'm not waiting for some doctor to wake up and sign paperwork. I understand the concern, sir, but nothing. His voice hardened. This is exactly what I was talking about yesterday. Support staff who think they understand operational requirements better than the operators themselves. You count bandages. I make life or death decisions. See the difference? Senior Chief Torres, standing behind Mercer, caught Natasha's eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head, a warning not to push the issue. She recognized the dynamic immediately. Torres knew Mercer was wrong, but also knew that contradicting him would only make things worse for everyone. I'll get Commander Whitmore's authorization. Sir, Natasha replied, reaching for the radio. No, Mercer's hand shot out, pressing the radio back down. You'll release the plasma now, or I'll file a report that medical support is interfering with mission-critical operations. How do you think that plays with the base commander? A supply tech blocking resources from a SEAL team heading into combat? The trap was elegant and vicious. Refuse, and she'd be blamed for potentially costing lives. Comply, and she'd be violating protocols that existed for good. Reasoned protocols designed to ensure critical resources went to the patients who truly needed them. Natasha felt the weight of 12 pairs of eyes watching her, waiting to see how she'd respond to the test. Her hands trembled slightly as she unlocked the plasma storage, knowing she was being backed into a corner, but seeing no way out that didn't result in her becoming the villain of someone's narrative. Thank you for your cooperation, Mercer said smoothly, his tone suggesting he'd won something more important than 6 units of plasma. See how easy that was? Sometimes support staff just need to trust that the professionals know what they're doing. As the SEAL team departed with their supplies, Staff Sergeant Brennan emerged from the medical bay office where he'd been watching the entire exchange through the window. His expression was thunderous. That was a power play, Brennan said flatly. Mercer didn't need that plasma. He's got a standard mission load that's more than adequate for his team size and mission profile. He just wanted to see if he could make you bend the rules. Natasha's voice was barely audible. What was I supposed to do? If something happens to one of his men and they need plasma, then they'll get it from the emergency stores, like everyone else, Brennan interrupted. Mercer knows that. He's been deployed enough times to understand medical protocols. This was about dominance, not necessity. The incident rippled through the base's informal communication networks. By lunch, everyone knew that the SEAL lieutenant had intimidated a medical tech into violating supply protocols. The story had different interpretations depending on who told it. Some saw Mercer as a decisive leader who wouldn't let bureaucracy endanger his men. Others saw him as a bully who exploited his position to push people around. Lieutenant Commander Whitmore heard the story from 3 different sources, each version slightly different, but all agreeing on the core facts. She pulled Natasha's personnel file and spent an hour reviewing it, her medical instincts telling her something wasn't adding up. Kline's file was remarkably thin for someone who'd been in the military for 3 years. Basic training, medical technician certification, deployment orders, and routine performance evaluations that praised her competence, but never quite explained the depth of knowledge she demonstrated. No disciplinary issues, no commendations, nothing that suggested she'd ever been anything other than exactly what her paperwork claimed. But Whitmore had spent enough years in military medicine to recognize when someone was performing below their actual capability. She'd seen it before: physicians who'd lost their licenses working as paramedics, surgeons hiding from malpractice allegations, doctors running from personal demons, people who knew too much to be what their papers said they were. The second incident came that evening during the SEALs training exercise. Mercer's team was running close-quarters battle drills in the kill house, a training facility designed to simulate urban combat environments. Standard protocol required a corpsman on standby for training injuries, and the duty rotation had assigned Natasha to cover the evening session. She arrived with a medical response kit, setting up a small aid station near the training entrance. For 2 hours, she sat in near darkness, listening to the sounds of flashbangs and simulated gunfire while the SEALs ran through their scenarios. The injury, when it came, was the kind of accident that happened when highly trained men pushed themselves to the edge of human performance. Petty Officer First Class Devin Wright took a training round to an unprotected section of his thigh during a live-fire exercise, not life-threatening, but bloody enough to require immediate attention. "Medic!" The call echoed from inside the kill house, urgent but controlled. Natasha grabbed her kit and sprinted toward the entrance. But Mercer's voice stopped her cold. "Hold up." "Librarian." He emerged from the kill house, barely winded despite the intense training. "Wright's fine. Just a flesh wound. I'll have Torres patch him up. You can wait here." "Sir, if there's an injury, protocol requires that I assess the situation and make command decisions." Mercer interrupted, stepping directly into her path. "Wright doesn't need someone who learned medicine from textbooks. He needs someone who's actually treated combat wounds in the field." The implication hung in the air that Natasha's training was theoretical while his team had real experience. What Mercer didn't know was that Natasha had performed emergency surgery on more gunshot wounds than everyone in his team combined. She'd operated in field hospitals under mortar fire, made triage decisions with mass casualties streaming in, and pioneered techniques that were now standard procedure across military medicine. But she couldn't say any of that without exposing who she really was. "Understood, sir," she replied. Stepping back, Wright emerged minutes later with a pressure bandage on his thigh, limping but mobile. Senior Chief Torres had done competent field first aid, but Natasha's trained eye immediately noticed the slight arterial bleeding that suggested the wound needed more attention than it had received. Not immediately life-threatening, but potentially problematic if infection set in or the bleeding worsened. She made a note in her medical log and said nothing. The third incident came the following morning during the pre-mission briefing. Base Commander Colonel Frank Garrison called a meeting of all personnel involved in supporting the upcoming operation. Natasha attended as the junior medical representative, standing in the back while officers discussed tactical plans and Logistics. Mercer spent 15 minutes outlining his team's objectives, a reconnaissance mission into hostile territory to gather intelligence on insurgent movements. When he reached the medical support section of his brief, his tone shifted to something approaching theatrical condescension. Medical support will be provided by FOB Sentinel's trauma team, Mercer said, his eyes finding Natasha in the back of the room. Though I'll be honest, Colonel, I have concerns about the quality of support personnel currently assigned to this base. Colonel Garrison frowned. What kind of concerns, Lieutenant? Yesterday, one of my men sustained a training injury. The corpsman on duty seemed more interested in following protocols than actually treating the wound. We ended up handling it ourselves, which frankly is what we prefer anyway. No offense to the medical staff, but there's a difference between classroom medicine and real-world trauma care. Lieutenant Commander Whitmore, seated near the front, turned to stare at Mercer with an expression that could freeze water. Lieutenant, are you suggesting that my medical staff is inadequately trained? I'm suggesting that some of your staff might be better suited to administrative roles than emergency response, Mercer replied smoothly. Again, no disrespect intended. Just operational reality. The meeting continued, but Natasha barely heard the rest. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, nails digging into palms hard enough to leave marks. 7 years of hiding, 7 years of silence, 7 years of watching lesser physicians make decisions she could have made better, all of it threatened to explode in a public confrontation that would destroy everything she'd built. After the briefing, Whitmore intercepted Natasha in the corridor outside the operations center. Walk with me. Kline. They moved away from the cluster of personnel, Whitmore's pace measured and deliberate. When they were alone, the commander stopped and turned to face Natasha directly. I've been practicing military medicine for 20 years, Whitmore said quietly. Long enough to recognize when someone knows more than they're letting on. You assessed Wright's injury from 15 feet away in poor lighting and immediately identified complications that Torres missed. That's not textbook knowledge. That's field experience. Natasha kept her expression neutral, but her heart was racing. I'm observant, ma'am. You're more than observant. Whitmore's eyes searched her face. I don't know what your story is, and I'm not going to pry. But I want you to know that if Lieutenant Mercer continues this pattern of behavior, you have support from the medical chain of command. His family connections don't impress me, and his trident doesn't give him the right to undermine medical personnel. Thank you, ma'am. Whitmore hesitated, then added, Mercer's team deploys tomorrow at 0600. They'll be gone 72 hours. During that time, I'd like you to assist with inventory review specifically. I want a complete audit of our trauma supplies and protocols. I have a feeling we might need to be prepared for something unusual. The words carried a weight that suggested Whitmore suspected more than she was saying. As Natasha walked back to her quarters that evening, she felt the walls closing in from multiple directions. Mercer's escalating hostility had painted a target on her back. Whitmore's suspicions threatened to expose secrets that could never safely come to light. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a quiet voice whispered that the approaching mission would become the stage where all her carefully constructed defenses would finally crumble. She opened her lockbox one more time, reading Daniel Ortega's letter by flashlight. You taught me that medicine isn't about glory, it's about being there when it matters most. Tomorrow, Mercer's team would disappear beyond the wire into hostile territory, and Natasha would be left at FOB Sentinel, scrubbing surgical tables and counting supplies. Forever trapped in the shadow of the physician she'd once been. She had no idea that in less than 48 hours, death would come for Jackson Mercer in a way that no amount of training or arrogance could prevent. And when it did, the quiet woman he'd dismissed as beneath his notice would face an impossible choice: maintain her cover and watch him die, or reveal everything she'd hidden for 7 years to save the life of a man who'd treated her like nothing The pressure had been building. Now it was about to explode. The emergency call came through at 0347 hours. 33 hours after Mercer's team had disappeared beyond the wire. Natasha was in the supply room conducting the inventory audit Whitmore had requested when the Vyungda base-wide alert pierced the pre-dawn silence. Her hands stilled on the clipboard as the loudspeaker crackled to life with words that sent every medical professional into immediate action. Mass casualty alert. Inbound medevac, ETA 12 minutes. All medical personnel report to Trauma Bay immediately. This is not a drill. She dropped the clipboard and ran. The Trauma Bay transformed into controlled chaos within 90 seconds. Lieutenant Commander Whitmore was already there, her surgical cap pulled tight as she barked orders to the arriving staff. Corpsmen scrambled to prepare treatment areas, laying out instrument trays and priming 4 lines with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this dozens of times before. "What do we know?" Whitmore demanded as Staff Sergeant Brennan entered at a sprint. "SEAL team hit an eye during extraction," Brennan reported, his voice tight. "Initial report: 2 critical, 3 urgent, 1 routine." Mercer's team. Natasha felt ice flood her veins. The professional part of her brain immediately began calculating. 2 critical meant life-threatening injuries requiring immediate surgical intervention. 3 urgent meant serious wounds that needed rapid treatment. 1 routine meant walking wounded who could wait. "Birds inbound!" Someone shouted from the landing zone. The Black Hawk appeared out of the darkness like an angry hornet, its landing lights cutting through the dust as it touched down hard on the helipad. The rear ramp dropped before the wheels had fully settled, and chaos spilled out. Senior Chief Torres emerged first, his uniform soaked in blood that clearly wasn't his own. His face carried the haunted expression of someone who'd watched his brothers die and been powerless to stop it. "We need a surgeon now," Torres shouted over the rotor wash. "Mercer took shrapnel to the femoral. He's got maybe 5 minutes before he bleeds out." The next few seconds unfolded with brutal clarity. 2 corpsmen rushed forward with a stretcher, carefully extracting Lieutenant Jackson Mercer from the helicopter. Even from 20 feet away, Natasha could see the catastrophic nature of his injury, blood pooling beneath him despite the tourniquet someone had applied. His face chalk white from hypovolemic shock. His breathing shallow and rapid. Behind him came 3 more casualties. Petty Officer Wright with a compound fracture of his left arm. Another SEAL with severe burns across his chest. And a third with what looked like a penetrating abdominal wound. The routine casualty had apparently stayed in the field. Lieutenant Commander Whitmore took one look at Mercer and made the triage decision that would change everything. Get him to SOF-1 immediately. Brennan, prep for emergency vascular surgery. Someone page Commander Hollis. She stopped mid-sentence, her face draining of color. "Shit. Hollis is at Bagram for the conference. He won't be back for 6 hours." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Commander Robert Hollis was the only vascular surgeon on base, the only person qualified to perform the complex arterial repair that Mercer needed to survive. Without him, standard protocol called for stabilizing the patient and evacuating to the next nearest surgical facility, a flight that would take 90 minutes minimum. "He doesn't have 90 minutes, Torres said flatly, his voice breaking. "The tourniquet's been on for 40 minutes already. Even if we fly him out now, he'll lose the leg at minimum. More likely he bleeds out in transit." Whitmore's face showed the agony of a physician facing an impossible situation. She could attempt the surgery herself. She had trauma training and had assisted on vascular cases, but femoral artery repair required a level of precision and experience she didn't possess. One mistake, one slip of the scalpel, and Mercer would bleed out on the table. "Get him on the table," Whitmore ordered, her voice steady despite the desperation in her eyes. "I'll do what I can. Brennan, I need you assisting. Kline, She turned to where Natasha stood frozen at the edge of the trauma bay. "Kline, you're scrubbing in. I need every hand available." The words punched through Natasha's paralysis like a physical blow. Scrubbing in meant entering the OR, meant being close enough to the surgery to see everything, meant being in a position where her knowledge and experience would be impossible to hide. But it also meant being there when Jackson Mercer arrogant, cruel, dismissive Jackson. Mercer fought for his life against injuries that were absolutely survivable with proper surgical intervention. "Ma'am, I'm not qualified to," Natasha began. But Whitmore cut her off with a look of pure steel. "I don't need you to operate. I need you to hand me instruments, monitor vitals, and do exactly what I tell you." "That's an order, Kline. Move." The trauma bay erupted into motion. Mercer was rushed into OR1, his blood pressure dropping with every second. The other casualties were triaged to separate treatment areas, all serious injuries. But none immediately life-threatening like Mercer's. Natasha found herself at the scrub sink beside Whitmore, mechanically following the 2-minute surgical scrub protocol while her mind raced through scenarios. She could assist passively, handing instruments and monitoring vitals while Whitmore struggled through a surgery she wasn't qualified to perform. Mercer would likely die, but no one could blame her for following orders, or she could intervene. Reveal her training, admit to 7 years of deception, and face whatever consequences came from exposing the truth she'd hidden for so long. The scrub room door opened and Brennan entered, already masked and gowned. His eyes found Natasha's over his surgical mask, and something in his expression suggested he'd already guessed what was coming. "Commander Whitmore," Brennan said carefully, "I've assisted on maybe a dozen surgeries in my career. All of them were straightforward trauma cases. I've never been inside a femoral repair." "Then today you learn," Whitmore replied. But her voice carried a tremor that betrayed her own uncertainty. They entered OR1 to find Mercer already on the table, his leg prepped and draped. The anesthesiologist, a young captain named Davis Chen, had him intubated and sedated. But the monitors told a grim story. Blood pressure 78/42 and dropping. Heart rate 142 and climbing. Oxygen saturation hovering at 89%. "Talk to me." "Chun," Whitmore demanded as she positioned herself at the surgical field. "He's compensating." "But barely," Chun replied, his voice tight. "I've got 4 units of O-negative running wide open, but he's lost at least 3 liters. He needs that artery repaired in the next 10 minutes or we're going to lose him." Whitmore made the first incision, her hand steady despite the impossible pressure. Blood immediately welled up from the surgical site, not the controlled bleeding of a careful dissection, but the pulsing flow of arterial damage that had been temporarily controlled by the tourniquet. "Suction," Whitmore snapped. And Brennan complied, clearing the field enough for her to see the damage. Natasha stood at the instrument table, her position giving her a perfect view of the surgical field. What she saw made her blood run cold. The shrapnel had torn through Mercer's femoral artery at the worst possible location, high up where the vessel branched, creating a complex injury that required more than simple repair. The surrounding tissue was damaged, complicating access. And Whitmore's first clamp placement, while competent, wasn't quite right positioned, too far distally. It would create excessive tension when she attempted the anastomosis. "Clamp," Whitmore called out, and Natasha handed her the requested instrument, watching as the commander attempted to gain proximal control of the bleeding vessel. The clamp slipped. Blood spurted across the surgical field. "Damn it!" Whitmore's frustration broke through her professional calm. "I can't see." "Brennan, more suction." Natasha's hands trembled as she held the instrument tray. Every instinct she'd developed over thousands of hours in operating rooms screamed at her to intervene, to correct the technical errors she could see accumulating with each passing second. "VP dropping 64/38, Chun announced, his voice rising with urgency. Heart rate 156. We're losing him, Commander. Whitmore made another attempt at clamping, this time getting better purchase but still not achieving the proximal control necessary for repair. Sweat beaded on her forehead, despite the cool temperature of the OR. I need better exposure, Whitmore muttered, more to herself than anyone else. If I extend the incision medially, that'll transect the saphenous nerve. Natasha heard herself say. Before she could stop the words, the OR went silent except for the beeping monitors and the hiss of the ventilator. Every eye turned toward her. What did you say? Whitmore demanded, her hands frozen over the surgical. Field. Natasha felt the moment crystallize. Around her, the point of no return where silence meant. Watching Mercer die and speaking meant destroying everything she'd built to protect herself. In her mind, she saw Daniel Ortega's letter. You taught me that medicine isn't about glory, it's about being there when it matters most. She saw the 4 people who died from Gerald Hutchins's contaminated medications while she'd been blamed and destroyed. She saw 7 years of hiding, of diminishment, of watching others practice medicine while she counted bandages and cleaned equipment. And she saw Jackson Mercer arrogant, cruel, dismissive, bleeding to death on a table because the surgeon trying to save him didn't have the skills this repair required. The choice, when it came, wasn't really a choice at all. If you extend medially, you'll transect the saphenous nerve, Natasha repeated, her voice gaining strength. You need to approach from a more lateral angle, retract the sartorius muscle, and get proximal control above the profunda femoris branch. The way you're positioned now, you'll never achieve adequate exposure for the anastomosis. Whitmore stared at her, comprehension dawning slowly. How do you know? Because I've done this repair 47 times. Natasha interrupted, the truth spilling out like water breaking through a dam. 47 femoral artery repairs in field hospitals under conditions worse than this. And if you don't let me take over right now, this man is going to bleed to death in the next 6 minutes. The monitors shrieked in alarm. BP 58/32. Chun shouted. He's crashing. Brennan's eyes widened in shock. Whitmore's face cycled through confusion, anger, and finally desperate calculation. Who the hell are you? Whitmore demanded. Right now, I'm the only person in this room who can save his life, Natasha replied. You can arrest me afterward, court-martial me, do whatever you want. But right now, either step aside and let me operate, or watch him die knowing you had a choice. The seconds stretched into eternity. Mercer's blood pressure continued dropping. The monitors screamed warnings. And Lieutenant Commander Sarah Whitmore faced the kind of decision that defined careers and haunted dreams. Finally, she stepped back from the table. If you're lying, if you touch him and he dies, I will personally destroy what's left of your life, Whitmore said quietly. But if you're telling the truth, she gestured toward the surgical field, then save him. Natasha moved to the table, and 7 years of exile evaporated in an instant. Her hands found their place on the surgical instruments with the comfort of coming home. Her eyes assessed the field with the practiced precision of someone who'd made these decisions hundreds of times. Brennan, reposition that retractor 15 degrees laterally, she commanded, her voice carrying an authority that hadn't been there moments before. Chun, push another unit and have 2 more standing by. Whitmore, I need you on suction, keep the field clear no matter what. And then Dr. Natasha Reeves began to operate. The ghost in surgical scrubs had just stepped back into the light. And nothing would ever be the same again. The transformation was instantaneous and absolute. The moment Natasha's hands touched the surgical instruments, every person in OR1 recognized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Her fingers moved with balletic precision, each motion economical and purposeful. She repositioned the retractors with micro-adjustments, that opened the surgical field like a flower blooming, revealing anatomy that had been obscured moments before. The bleeding that had seemed uncontrollable under Whitmore's attempts suddenly became manageable under Natasha's systematic approach. "Proximal clamp," she stated calmly, her voice carrying none of the panic that had infected the room minutes earlier. Brennan handed her the instrument, his movements awkward compared to her fluid efficiency. She placed the clamp with absolute confidence, achieving immediate control of the hemorrhaging vessel. The pulsing arterial spray stopped. "BP stabilizing," Chun announced, disbelief coloring his voice. 68/44, still critical, but the free fall stopped. Natasha's eyes never left the surgical field. "Whitmore, I need perfect suction." "Brennan, that retractor needs constant tension. If the muscle shifts even 2 millimeters, I lose visualization." "Chun, keep him stable." "I need 12 minutes of clean operating time." She began the meticulous work of debriding damaged tissue, her movements so precise they seemed choreographed. Every cut served a purpose. Every motion advanced the repair toward completion. This wasn't the desperate surgery of someone trying to remember forgotten skills. This was mastery. The kind that came from thousands of hours of practice and hundreds of similar repairs. "How long have you been doing vascular surgery?" Whitmore asked quietly, her role reduced to assisting someone she'd thought was a basic medical technician. 15 years, Natasha replied without looking up. "Started my vascular fellowship at Johns Hopkins, finished at Naval Medical Center Portsmouth. Deployed to 3 combat zones. Published 22 papers on battlefield trauma management." The words hung in the air like bombs waiting to detonate. Brennan nearly dropped his retractor. Chun's eyes went wide above his mask. But Whitmore's expression showed only grim calculation. She was already thinking ahead to the explanations this would require. "The anastomosis is going to be challenging," Natasha continued, her focus absolute. "The vessel wall is damaged for approximately 3 centimeters. I'll need to resect the damaged section and do an end-to-end repair with tension-relieving sutures. Brennan, when I call for 6-0 proline, I need it threaded and ready. No delays." She worked in silence for the next 8 minutes, her hands performing a surgical ballet that none of them had seen before. The damaged section of artery was carefully excised. The vessel ends were prepared with microscopic precision. And then began the anastomosis, the delicate process of reconnecting the artery with sutures finer than human hair. Each stitch was placed with mathematical precision, the needle passing through vessel wall at exact angles that would ensure proper healing and prevent stenosis. Natasha's hands never trembled, never hesitated. She worked with the calm certainty of someone who'd done this so many times that the movements had become instinctive. "Preparing to release the proximal clamp," she announced. "Chun, have pressors ready in case we get a pressure spike." "Whitmore, suction on standby." She removed the clamp with controlled deliberation. Blood flowed through the repaired vessel, and for 3 eternal seconds, everyone in the OR held their breath, waiting to see if the anastomosis would hold. It held perfectly. No leaks, no bleeding. Just smooth, pulsing flow through a vessel that had been torn apart minutes before. "Distal clamp off," Natasha said, and removed the second clamp. Again, perfect flow. The repair was complete. "BP 94/58, Chun reported, his voice thick with emotion. Heart rate dropping to 118, peripheral pulses strong bilaterally. Jesus Christ, it actually worked. Natasha began the closure, layer by layer, each suture placed with the same precision as the arterial repair. As she worked, the reality of what she'd just done began to settle over the room like fallout. "Skin closure," she announced, making the final sutures. "Brennan, apply the dressing." "Chun, keep him sedated for the next 4 hours. I want him completely still while that repair sets." She stepped back from the table, strips of blood covering her gown, and met Whitmore's eyes for the first time since taking over the surgery. He'll live, Natasha said simply. Barring infection or complications, he'll make a full recovery. The leg is saved. He'll probably have minimal functional deficit. The OR remained frozen in tableau, everyone processing what they'd witnessed. Then Whitmore pulled down her mask, her expression unreadable. "Everyone out except Kline," Whitmore ordered. "Chun, monitor him in recovery. Brennan, brief the SEAL team that their lieutenant survived. No details about the surgery yet. Move." The room emptied in seconds, leaving only Natasha and Whitmore standing across the operating table from each other. Through the window, Natasha could see faces pressed against the glass where it had spread, and what seemed like half the base was watching. "Who are you?" Whitmore asked again, her voice dangerously quiet. Natasha pulled down her mask, suddenly exhausted. 7 years of hiding had just evaporated in 12 minutes of surgery. "My name is Natasha Reeves. I was Commander, Navy Medical Corps, Chief of Trauma Surgery at Portsmouth. 7 years ago, I was court-martialed for negligence that resulted in the deaths of 3 Marines. Were you guilty?" "No," the word came out flat and emotionless. "My department head was selling experimental medications to black market dealers. When people died from contaminated supplies, he manufactured evidence to frame me. I was stripped of my commission, lost my medical license, and changed my identity to avoid the continued persecution." Whitmore's face showed no reaction. "Can you prove any of this?" "Rear Admiral Patricia Thornwood can verify my identity and the circumstances of my court-martial. The investigative files are sealed, but they exist. And if you review Gerald Hutchins's service record, he was the department head who framed me. You'll find he died 4 years ago under circumstances that suggested he was involved in criminal activity. And you've been hiding here. Working as a medical technician for how long? 3 years at this base. 4 years at other installations before that." Natasha's voice remained steady despite the exhaustion crushing down on her. "I changed my name legally, let my medical credentials lapse, and disappeared. It seemed safer than continuing to fight a system that had already decided I was guilty." Whitmore walked to the OR window and stared out at the crowd of observers. When she turned back, her expression had shifted from interrogator to something more complex. "That surgery you just performed? I've assisted on maybe 5 femoral repairs in my entire career, all done by Hollis, and none of them were as clean as what I just watched. That wasn't textbook medicine. That was artistry. I had good teachers," Natasha said quietly. "You saved Mercer's life. The same man who spent the last 48 hours treating you like garbage, who publicly humiliated you, who represents everything toxic about the old boys network that probably helped destroy your career." Whitmore's eyes searched Natasha's face. "Why? You could have let me struggle. Could have watched him die. No one would have blamed you." The question struck deeper than Whitmore probably intended. Natasha thought about Daniel Ortega's letter, about being there when it mattered most. She thought about the oath she'd taken, about the responsibility that came with having skills others didn't possess. "Because he's someone's son," Natasha finally said. "Someone's brother, someone's teammate. And because the person I was before all this happened, Commander Reeves, she wouldn't have hesitated. I couldn't become someone who lets people die just because they treated me badly. That would mean Hutchins really did destroy me." Whitmore nodded slowly, as if Natasha had just confirmed something she'd suspected. "The other casualties from Mercer's team, I need you to examine them. Wright's fracture needs surgical fixation. And I'm not convinced the corpsman who treated the abdominal wound caught everything." "Commander, I'm not authorized to. Right now, I don't give a damn about authorization," Whitmore interrupted. "I have 4 wounded SEALs, and you're the most qualified surgeon within 200 miles. We'll sort out the legalities later. Right now I need you to be who you actually are instead of who you've been pretending to be." They worked through the night. Wright's compound fracture required 3 hours of orthopedic surgery that Natasha performed with the same precision she'd shown on Mercer. The seal with abdominal wounds did indeed have a small perforation that the initial treatment had missed, caught early enough to prevent peritonitis, but only because Natasha's examination was more thorough than standard protocol required. By 0800 hours, all casualties were stable and resting in the recovery ward. Natasha stripped off her surgical gown for the last time, her body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline crash. Senior Chief Torres found her in the scrub room, his face haggard from stress and lack of sleep, but his eyes clear with purpose. "Doc," he said, using the title deliberately, "I need to know. The woman who saved Lieutenant Mercer's life, is she the same woman he treated like trash 2 days ago?" "Yes," Natasha replied simply. Torres studied her for a long moment. "He owes you his life. We all do. I don't know your full story, but I know what I saw in that OR. That was surgeon work. Master-level surgeon work." He paused, emotion cracking his professional composure. "Thank you for not letting our mistake in following him cost him his life." "He's your brother," Natasha said. "That's what matters." As Torres walked away, Natasha caught sight of herself in the scrub room mirror. She looked exactly as she had that morning, same face, same tired eyes, same surgical cap. But everything had changed. The ghost in surgical scrubs had just performed medicine in front of dozens of witnesses. The secret she'd protected for 7 years was now exposed to the harsh light of military scrutiny. Through the window, she could see the sun rising over Forward Sentinel, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. In the recovery ward, Jackson Mercer slept peacefully, unaware that the woman he'd dismissed as beneath his notice had just saved his life with skills he'd claimed she could never possess. And somewhere in the command center, calls were already being made to higher authorities. Questions were being asked. Records were being pulled. The machinery of military justice was grinding back to life, preparing to confront a ghost who just revealed herself in the most public way possible. Natasha had made her choice in that OR. Now she would face whatever consequences came from refusing to let a man die. Even when staying hidden would have been safer, the demonstration of mastery was complete. What came next would determine whether truth and competence could overcome institutional betrayal, or whether the system that had destroyed her once would finish the job. But for this moment, in the quiet aftermath of life-saving surgery, Dr. Natasha Reeves allowed herself to feel something she hadn't experienced in 7 years, the profound satisfaction of being exactly who she was meant to be. Consequences be damned. The convoy arrived at Forward Sentinel at 1400 hours. 6 black SUVs with Pentagon plates and enough brass to staff a small war. Word had traveled fast through military channels. A Coendu, disgraced surgeon working under false identity, had performed emergency vascular surgery and saved a SEAL team leader's life. The story was too explosive to contain. Natasha was in the recovery ward checking on Mercer's post-operative status when Staff Sergeant Brennan found her, his expression grave. "Kline Reeves, whoever you are," he said quietly. "You need to see this." She followed him to the window overlooking the main compound. The visiting convoy had disgorged a dozen senior officers, led by a woman whose silver hair and 3 stars identified her immediately. Rear Admiral Patricia Thornwood. Natasha's knees nearly buckled. She hadn't seen Thornwood in 7 years, not since the Admiral's emergency reassignment had prevented her from testifying at the court-martial. The last communication between them had been a brief, encrypted email where Thornwood had warned Natasha that Hutchins's network ran deeper than either of them had suspected. "That's a lot of firepower for one unauthorized surgery," Brennan observed. "You want to tell me what's really going on?" Before Natasha could answer, Lieutenant Commander Whitmore appeared in the corridor, her face tight with stress. "Reeves, you're wanted in the base commander's office, now." She paused. Then added more quietly, I submitted my report 3 hours ago. Told them everything, the surgery, your real identity, my decision to let you operate. Whatever happens next, I'm standing by what I wrote. You saved 4 lives last night. The walk to Colonel Garrison's office felt like a march to execution. Personnel stopped and stared as she passed, whispers following in her wake. By now, everyone on base knew that the quiet medical tech was actually a disgraced surgeon with a mysterious past. The command center conference room was packed. Colonel Garrison sat at the head of the table, flanked by Rear Admiral Thornwood and a civilian in a dark suit whose credentials identified him as Department of Defense Inspector General. Around the table sat various officers representing JAG, Naval Medical Command, and Special Operations. And in a wheelchair near the window, connected to an 4-pole, sat Lieutenant Jackson Mercer. He was awake, pale but alert, his eyes widening when Natasha entered the room. Someone had clearly briefed him on who had actually saved his life, because his expression cycled rapidly through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been shame. Commander Reeves, Admiral Thornwood said, her voice carrying across the silent room. Or should I say Technician Kline? Ma'am, I legally changed my name to Natasha Kline 7 years ago, Natasha replied, standing at attention. I've been using that identity since my discharge from active duty. Discharge? The Inspector General's voice was sharp. Commander, you were court-martialed and dismissed from service. That's considerably different from a discharge. Yes, sir. Thornwood leaned forward, her eyes locked on Natasha's face. For the record, I need you to state your full service history. Start from the beginning. Natasha took a breath and began. She described her medical training, her fellowship in vascular surgery, her 3 combat deployments. She detailed her work at Naval Medical Center Portsmouth, her research on battlefield trauma protocols, her promotion to Chief of Trauma Surgery at age 29. Then she described Gerald Hutchins. Lieutenant Commander Hutchins was my department head, Natasha said, her voice steady despite the memories. He was also running a black market operation selling experimental medications and controlled substances. When 3 Marines died from contaminated supplies, the investigation threatened to expose his network. So he framed you, Thornwood finished. Manufactured evidence, coerced testimony, falsified records. And he had enough political connections to make it stick. Yes, ma'am. The Inspector General made notes on a tablet. Commander Reeves, are you aware that Lieutenant Commander Hutchins died 4 years ago under circumstances that suggested criminal activity? I heard rumors, sir. Nothing official. The official story was a car accident, the Inspector General continued. The unofficial story is that he was killed by associates in his black market network when he became a liability. Before he died, he made certain confessions to a Navy chaplain confessions that were considered privileged communication at the time. Natasha's heart began to race. Sir? Those confessions have since been declassified as part of an ongoing investigation into corruption within military medical supply chains. The Inspector General pulled up a document on his tablet. Hutchins admitted to framing you. He provided details of how he manufactured evidence, which officers he bribed or coerced, and how he used his family's political connections to ensure the court-martial went his way. The room erupted in murmurs. Colonel Garrison looked like someone had punched him in the stomach. Several of the junior officers exchanged shocked glances, but Natasha felt nothing. The vindication she'd dreamed about for 7 years arrived as a flat, hollow fact. Hutchins was dead. The truth was exposed. And she was still standing in a conference room, answering for the crime of saving a man's life. Admiral Thornwood stood, her voice cutting through the noise. Commander Reeves, the Navy owes you an apology that can never adequately address what was done to you. You were innocent. The evidence that convicted you was fabricated. The officers who testified against you were coerced or paid off. You should never have lost your commission, your medical license, or your career. She pulled an envelope from her briefcase, heavy with official seals. I carry orders signed by the Chief of Naval Operations for your full reinstatement. Restoration of rank with back pay. Restoration of all privileges and honors. Command of your choice at any naval medical facility worldwide. This includes a formal apology from the Secretary of the Navy and compensation for wrongful termination. The envelope lay on the table between them like a live grenade. There's more. Thornwood continued. Your research on battlefield trauma protocols has saved an estimated 200 lives since its implementation. Your techniques are now standard across all military medical services. You deserve recognition for that contribution, regardless of the injustice you suffered. Natasha stared at the envelope, processing information that should have felt like victory, but instead felt like salt in old wounds. Jackson. Mercer cleared his throat from his wheelchair. Ma'am, may I speak? Thornwood nodded. Mercer wheeled himself closer to the table, his face flushed with emotion and medication. I need to say something. 48 hours ago, I treated Commander Reeves like garbage. I mocked her, dismissed her abilities, publicly humiliated her, and made her life miserable because I thought she was just a medical tech who didn't deserve my respect. His voice cracked. Last night, she saved my life. She performed surgery that I'm told maybe 5 people in the military could have pulled off. And she did it knowing who I was, knowing how I'd treated her, knowing she could have just let me die and no one would have blamed her. He looked directly at Natasha, his eyes red-rimmed. I was wrong. About everything. About you, about support personnel, about what matters in the military. I'm sorry doesn't even begin to cover it, but I'm saying it anyway. I'm sorry. Senior Chief Torres, standing near the door, added his voice. Commander Reeves also treated 3 other casualties from our team last night. All of them are stable because of her intervention. She didn't have to do any of it. She could have maintained her cover and let Commander Whitmore struggle through. But she stepped up because that's who she is. Lieutenant Commander Whitmore stood. For the record, I want to state that Commander Reeves's actions last night were extraordinary by any measure. She performed under extreme pressure with minimal support and achieved results that exceeded anything I've seen in 20 years of military medicine. Whatever administrative irregularities exist regarding her identity or status, her medical competence is beyond question. The Inspector General made more notes. Commander Reeves, why didn't you appeal your court-martial? Fight the charges? Expose Hutchins when you had the chance? I tried, sir, Natasha replied. But Hutchins's network was extensive. Officers I trusted turned out to be compromised. Evidence I gathered disappeared. Witnesses recanted or refused to testify. And Admiral Thornwood, the one person with enough rank and integrity to help me, was reassigned before she could intervene. So you gave up, the Inspector General said. No, sir. I survived. Natasha's voice gained strength. I changed my identity, found work that let me stay close to medicine, and waited for the truth to surface. Because I knew eventually it would. Lies that big always collapse under their own weight. Admiral Thornwood picked up the envelope and walked around the table, stopping directly in front of Natasha. Commander, the Navy wants to make this right. Full restoration, promotion to captain, command of the new Trauma Research Center at Walter Reed. You'd be in charge of developing next-generation battlefield medicine protocols. It's everything you worked for before Hutchins destroyed your career. She held out the envelope. All you have to do is accept. Natasha looked at the envelope, then at the faces around the table, Thornwood's earnest determination, Whitmore's supportive nod, Mercer's guilt-ridden hope, Torres's respect, Brennan's quiet encouragement. 7 years ago, she would have grabbed that envelope with both hands. 7 years ago, the restoration of her rank and career would have meant everything. But 7 years in exile had taught her things that Commander Natasha Reeves had never understood. She'd learned that identity couldn't be stripped away by others, that competence spoke louder than rank, that the opinions of people who judged her without knowing her were meaningless. She'd learned that the woman she became in the shadows was stronger than the woman who'd fallen from grace. "Ma'am," Natasha said quietly, "I need time to think about this." The room erupted again, this time in genuine shock. Admiral Thornwood's eyes widened. "Commander, this is full vindication. Complete restoration. Everything you lost." "I understand, ma'am. But I lost those things 7 years ago. The person I've become since then isn't the same person who lost them." Natasha met Thornwood's eyes steadily. "I'm not saying no. I'm saying I need time to decide who I want to be going forward, instead of just becoming who I used to be." Colonel Garrison found his voice. "Commander Reeves, you do understand that there will be an investigation into your use of false identity on a military installation? Regardless of the circumstances that led to it." "I understand, sir," Natasha interrupted. "I'll cooperate fully with any investigation. I'm not running anymore. But I'm also not making life-changing decisions while running on 4 hours of sleep after performing 3 emergency surgeries." Admiral Thornwood studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough. You've earned the right to make your own choices instead of having them made for you." She placed the envelope on the table in front of Natasha. "But understand that this offer has an expiration date. The Navy wants to make this right, but there are political realities to consider." "How long do I have, ma'am?" 72 hours, Thornwood replied. "After that, the media will get hold of this story, and everything becomes exponentially more complicated." As the meeting broke up, Jackson Mercer wheeled himself over to where Natasha stood gathering her thoughts. "Doc," he said quietly, "I know I have no right to ask you anything. But if you decide to take that reinstatement, I want you to know something. What happened last night, you stepping up despite everything I'd done, that changed me. Changed how I see things. I'm going to be a better officer because of it. A better person." Natasha looked down at the man who'd made her life miserable for 48 hours, who now owed her his life and his leg. "Lieutenant, you have a second chance. Don't waste it trying to impress people who don't matter. Use it to become someone who treats every person with dignity, regardless of their rank or position." "Yes, ma'am," Mercer said, and for the first time. The words carried genuine respect. As Natasha left the command center, she found half the base personnel lined up outside, waiting. They parted to let her through, and someone started clapping. Within seconds, the applause spread. Corpsmen, soldiers, support staff, even junior officers joining in. Staff Sergeant Brennan stood at attention and saluted her. "Commander." She returned the salute, then kept walking toward her shipping container quarters, processing everything that had just been revealed. The truth was finally out. The injustice was acknowledged. The offer of restoration sat in an envelope waiting for her decision. But as Natasha opened her lockbox and pulled out Daniel Ortega's letter one more time, she realized that the biggest question wasn't whether to accept the Navy's offer. The biggest question was whether Commander Natasha Reeves, the woman she used to be, was who she wanted to become again, or whether the ghost in surgical scrubs had discovered something more valuable than rank and recognition. She had 72 hours to decide. The 72 hours stretched before Natasha like a minefield. Every decision she made during this window would ripple forward into a future she could barely envision. She spent the first 12 hours sleeping, genuine, dreamless sleep for the first time in years. When she woke, her body felt lighter, as if the weight of 7 years of secrets had been physically pressing down on her shoulders. The base had transformed overnight. Personnel who'd previously looked through her now sought her out. Junior corpsmen asked medical questions with genuine respect. Even the mess hall staff gave her extra portions and better coffee. The invisible woman had become hyper-visible. And Natasha found the attention more uncomfortable than the previous anonymity. On the morning of her second day of deliberation, she found Lieutenant Commander Whitmore waiting outside her quarters with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that suggested this wasn't a casual visit. "Walk with me," Whitmore said. Handing her a cup, they moved toward the perimeter of the base, away from listening ears and curious eyes. The Afghan desert stretched endlessly around them, beautiful and hostile in equal measure. "I read your full service record," Whitmore began. "The real one, not the sanitized version Hutchins created. You were extraordinary, Natasha. Not just competent, transformational. Your research changed how we approach battlefield drama. Your surgical outcomes were statistically impossible by conventional standards." "Past tense," Natasha observed quietly. "That's the question, isn't it?" Whitmore stopped walking and turned to face her. "What do you want? Not what the Navy wants, not what you think you should want. What does Natasha Reeves actually want for the next chapter of her life?" The question pierced deeper than Thornwood's offer of reinstatement. Natasha stared out at the desert, processing emotions she'd kept suppressed for years. 7 years ago, I wanted vindication," she said slowly. "I wanted everyone who doubted me to see the truth. I wanted Hutchins exposed and punished. I wanted my career back exactly as it had been. And now? Now I realize that the woman who wanted those things doesn't exist anymore." Natasha took a sip of coffee, buying time to organize her thoughts. Commander Reeves was brilliant but naive. She believed the system would protect people who told the truth. She thought competence and integrity were enough. She didn't understand how politics and corruption could override everything else. "And Natasha Kline?" Whitmore prompted. "Who is she?" "Someone who learned that identity can't be taken away by courts or tribunals. Someone who discovered that the work matters more than the recognition. Someone who—" Natasha paused, searching for words. "Someone who found peace in the shadows that she never had in the spotlight." Whitmore nodded slowly. But Natasha Kline was also running, hiding, living half a life because she was too afraid to be fully herself. The admission hurt more than Natasha expected. "And I'm tired of being afraid." They walked in silence for several minutes before Whitmore spoke again. "I have a proposition. It's completely unofficial and might be overstepping, but I'm going to say it anyway." Natasha waited. "What if there's a third option? Not Commander Reeves returning to exactly what she was, and not Natasha Kline hiding in the shadows. What if you could build something new that combines the best of both?" "I'm listening." "The military is changing," Whitmore explained. "Slowly, painfully, but changing. Your story, what happened to you and how you survived it matters. Not just as vindication, but as evidence that the system needs reform." She pulled out a tablet and brought up a document. Admiral Thornwood mentioned a trauma research center at Walter Reed. What she didn't mention is that they're also establishing a peer support program for medical personnel who faced professional retaliation. People who reported misconduct and got destroyed for it. People who need advocates who understand what they're going through. Natasha felt something shift in her chest. "You're suggesting I run a support program?" "I'm suggesting you could do both. Run the Trauma Research Center, use your skills where they'll save the most lives. But also create a structure that protects the next person who finds themselves in the situation you faced. Make sure no one else has to spend 7 years in exile because they told the truth." The idea took root immediately, growing into something that felt more right than simple reinstatement ever could. Not just returning to who she'd been, but becoming someone new, someone shaped by both triumph and trauma, by both competence and humility. "There's a catch," Whitmore continued. "This would be high profile. Media attention, congressional testimony, the whole circus. You'd be the face of military medical reform. No more hiding, no more anonymity. Everything about your story would become public knowledge. Natasha thought about Daniel Ortega's letter, about being there when it mattered most. She thought about the 3 Marines who died from Hutchins's contaminated medications, and the dozens of others who'd probably suffered from his corruption. She thought about the next bright young physician who might speak up about wrongdoing, and whether that person would be protected or destroyed. "I need to talk to someone," she said finally, that afternoon. Natasha visited the recovery ward where Jackson Mercer was recuperating. His leg was elevated, connected to monitoring equipment, but his color was good and his vitals were strong. Senior Chief Torres sat beside him, reviewing mission reports. "Commander," Mercer said, attempting to sit up straighter, "I didn't expect to see you." "I have a question for you, Lieutenant." Natasha pulled up a chair. "When you go back to your team, what are you going to tell them about what happened here?" Mercer exchanged a glance with Torres before answering. "The truth. That I was an arrogant ass who treated you like garbage, and you saved my life anyway. That I learned more about leadership from watching you operate than I learned in 5 years of special operations." "Will they listen?" "Some will," Torres interjected. "Some won't. But the ones who matter will hear it. And it'll spread. Not just in our team, but throughout the community. The story about the surgeon who was destroyed by the system but stayed, true to her oath anyway, that's the kind of thing operators respect." Natasha nodded, processing. "What if I told you that accepting my reinstatement means becoming a public figure? Testifying before Congress about corruption in military medicine? Being in the spotlight constantly?" Mercer's response was immediate. "Then I'd say you owe it to everyone who can't fight back. You have a platform now, Commander. Use it. Make sure what happened to you can't happen to someone else." That evening, Natasha sat in her shipping container quarters with the envelope Admiral Thornwood had given her. Inside were official orders, forms to sign, agreements to review. The machinery of bureaucracy attempting to undo 7 years of injustice with paperwork and procedures. She thought about Commander Natasha Reeves, young, brilliant, idealistic, naive about how the world really worked. That woman had been destroyed by a corrupt system. But something stronger had emerged from the wreckage. She thought about Natasha Kline, invisible. Competent, scared, running from a past she couldn't escape. That woman had survived through silence and anonymity. But survival wasn't the same as living, and she thought about who she could become, someone who'd seen both sides, who understood both triumph and defeat, who could use her story to build something better than what had existed before. The decision, when it finally crystallized, was both terrifying and liberating. Natasha pulled out her phone and called Admiral Thornwood's direct line. The Admiral answered on the second ring. "Commander Reeves, have you made a decision?" "Yes, ma'am. But not the one you're expecting." She explained Whitmore's suggestion, the Trauma Research Center combined with advocacy work, the peer support program for medical personnel facing retaliation, the commitment to reforming the systems that had destroyed her. "But I have conditions," Natasha continued. "I'll accept reinstatement and promotion. I'll take the command position at Walter Reed. I'll testify before Congress and tell my story publicly. But I do it as myself, not as a sanitized version that makes the Navy look good. I tell the whole truth, including the parts that are uncomfortable and embarrassing for the institution." Thornwood was silent for a long moment. "You understand that complete transparency might make things difficult? That there are people who'd prefer this story be managed carefully?" "Ma'am, I spent 7 years managing their comfort by hiding in silence. I'm done with that. If the Navy wants me back, they get all of me, the competence and the inconvenient truth. Take it or leave it." She heard the smile in Thornwood's voice. "Commander, I didn't fight to clear your name just to have you come back as a puppet. Your conditions are acceptable. More than acceptable, they're exactly what this institution needs, even if it doesn't realize it yet. Then I accept. But I need one more thing. Name it." When I testify before Congress, I want to do it alongside other medical personnel who faced retaliation for reporting misconduct. Make it clear this isn't just my story, it's systemic. And we're going to fix it together. I'll make it happen, Thornwood promised. Welcome back, Commander. The Navy is lucky to have you, even if we don't deserve you. After the call ended, Natasha sat in silence, processing the enormity of what she'd just agreed to. No more hiding. No more anonymity. No more safety in the shadows, but also no more running. No more living as half a person. No more watching from the sidelines while others did the work she was born to do. She opened her lockbox one final time and pulled out Daniel Ortega's letter. His words had sustained her through 7 years of exile, reminding her of who she'd been and who she could still become. Now she added her own letter, written to no one in particular, but to everyone who might one day find themselves where she'd been. To whoever needs this, they can take your rank, your credentials, your reputation. They can manufacture evidence and destroy your career. But they cannot take your competence, your integrity, or your commitment to doing what's right. Those things live inside you, untouchable by courts or tribunals. I spent 7 years hiding because I was afraid of what they could still take from me. I was wrong. They'd already taken everything they could. What remained was mine alone, and I should have claimed it sooner. If you're reading this because you're facing similar circumstances, know this: you're not alone. The system that failed you is broken, but it can be fixed. Your story matters. Your truth matters. And someone like me is fighting to make sure you don't have to go through what I did. Be there when it matters most. That's all any of us can do. Dr. Natasha Reeves, Commander, United States Navy. She placed the letter in the lockbox alongside Ortega's, closed it, and set it aside. Tomorrow she would begin the process of transitioning back to active duty. There would be paperwork, medical boards, official ceremonies, and media attention. But tonight, for the first time in 7 years, Dr. Natasha Reeves slept as herself, not hiding, not running, not afraid of the future she was about to build. The ghost in surgical scrubs had finally chosen to step fully into the light, and the world was about to discover that some truths, once revealed, could change everything. The collapse of Jackson Mercer's career began within hours of Natasha's decision to accept reinstatement. The video footage from OR, one standard recording protocol for complex surgeries, had been reviewed by multiple medical boards and ethics committees. What they saw was damning. Mercer's femoral artery repair required intervention from someone he'd publicly humiliated, someone whose expertise he'd dismissed as non-existent. But the real devastation came from an unexpected source. Petty Officer Devin Wright, still recovering from his compound fracture, requested a meeting with the base inspector general. What he revealed triggered an investigation that went far beyond Mercer's treatment of one medical technician. Wright provided documented evidence of a pattern spanning 18 months. Systematic harassment of support personnel, falsified mission reports to inflate Mercer's performance metrics, misuse of military resources for personal gain, and intimidation of team members who questioned his decisions. Senior Chief Torres, finally freed from fear of retaliation, corroborated every claim and added details that painted Mercer not as a heroic operator, but as a toxic leader whose political connections had shielded him from accountability. The investigation expanded rapidly. Other SEALs came forward, not just from Mercer's team, but from his previous assignments. Supply sergeants reported requisition irregularities. Base commanders from 3 installations described complaints they'd been pressured to bury. Medical personnel shared stories of Mercer demanding special treatment and threatening career consequences for anyone who refused. Within a week, Lieutenant Jackson Mercer faced 9 formal charges ranging from conduct unbecoming an officer to dereliction of duty. His family's political connections, which had protected him for years, suddenly became liabilities. Congressmen and admirals, who'd once been allies now rushed to distance them from the scandal. The court-martial hearing took place 30 days after. Natasha's surgery saved his life. She didn't attend, but she read the transcripts. Mercer's defense was that he'd been operating within a culture that rewarded aggressive leadership and punished weakness. His attorney argued that he was a product of a system that valued operational results over interpersonal conduct, that his treatment of support personnel, while regrettable, was consistent with SEAL community norms. Prosecution demolished this argument with testimony from dozens of SEAL operators who managed to maintain elite performance standards without abusing their authority. Senior Chief Torres delivered particularly devastating testimony about the difference between demanding excellence and demanding submission. The verdict was unanimous: guilty on 7 of 9 charges. Lieutenant Jackson Mercer was stripped of his commission, forfeited all pay and benefits, and received a dishonorable discharge. His trident was formally revoked in a ceremony that required him to surrender the symbol he'd worn with such pride. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The man who dismissed Natasha for lacking qualifications had himself been judged unqualified for the uniform he wore, but Mercer's fall was just the beginning. The investigation his case triggered metastasized into something far larger. The Inspector General's office began examining how toxic leaders throughout Special Operations Command had been protected by networks of complicit officers. Congressional oversight committees demanded explanations for why multiple complaints against Mercer and others like him had been buried or ignored. Admiral Thornwood used the momentum to push through reforms that had been languishing in bureaucratic purgatory for years. New protocols for investigating misconduct complaints, independent review boards for cases involving senior officers, protection for personnel who reported wrongdoing, mandatory training on professional conduct that emphasized that special operations status didn't exempt anyone from basic standards of decency. Gerald Hutchins's case was reopened posthumously, and investigators discovered his corruption had been far more extensive than anyone suspected. He'd operated a network of compromised officers across multiple installations, all of them trading favors and protecting each other from accountability. 7 current officers faced criminal charges. 12 more were forced into retirement. The pharmaceutical companies he'd worked with faced federal prosecution for their role in the contaminated medication scandal. Civil suits from the families of the 3 Marines who died resulted in settlements totaling $47 million. Money that could never replace lost lives, but at least acknowledge the truth of what had happened. Natasha watched these dominoes fall from Walter Reed, where she'd begun her new position as director of the Trauma Research Center. The media coverage was intense and relentless. Her story became the catalyst for a broader reckoning within military culture about how institutions protected the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. She gave 17 interviews in the first month, congressional testimony before 3 different committees, a 60 minutes profile that drew 20 million viewers. Every appearance was carefully calibrated to emphasize not just her personal vindication, but the systemic changes needed to prevent similar injustices. The peer support program she'd proposed grew faster than anyone anticipated. Within 60 days, 200 active-duty medical personnel had contacted her office doctors, nurses, corpsmen, and technicians who'd faced retaliation for reporting misconduct. Each one represented a story similar to hers, someone who'd told the truth and been destroyed for it. Natasha built a team to handle the influx. Former JAG officers who specialized in whistleblower protection, victim advocates who understood military culture, mental health professionals who could help people process the trauma of institutional betrayal. The program became a model for similar efforts across all service branches, but perhaps the most significant consequence was cultural. The story of the quiet medical tech who saved the life of the officer who'd humiliated her became a touchstone for discussions about respect, competence, and the true meaning of leadership. It was taught at officer training schools, discussed in professional development seminars, and referenced in conversations about command climate. The phrase, "Don't be a Mercer," entered military vocabulary as shorthand for toxic leadership. Conversely, Reeves' standard became slang for maintaining professional competence and personal integrity, even under adverse circumstances. Colonel Frank Garrison, the base commander who'd allowed Mercer's behavior to flourish unchecked, was quietly reassigned to a desk job at Pentagon Logistics. He retired 6 months later with a carefully worded evaluation that praised his administrative competence while noting challenges in command climate management. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Whitmore received a commendation for her handling of the medical crisis and her courage in supporting Natasha's decision to operate. She was promoted to commander, and given her choice of assignments, she chose to stay at FOB Sentinel, implementing the medical reforms Natasha had designed. Staff Sergeant Tyler Brennan was promoted to Master Sergeant and assigned to the new Military Medical Ethics Training Center, where he taught courses on recognizing and supporting competence, regardless of rank or position. His first-hand account of watching Natasha transform from invisible technician to life-saving surgeon became a centerpiece of discussions about how assumptions blind us to excellence. The Cone, 4 SEALs whose lives Natasha had saved, including Wright, whose testimony had triggered the investigation, formed an unusual support network. They testified at congressional hearings, participated in military ethics seminars, and became advocates for treating support personnel with dignity. Their willingness to speak publicly about their own complicity in Mercer's toxic leadership gave their advocacy particular credibility. Senior Chief Raymond Torres received a formal letter of reprimand for failing to report Mercer's misconduct earlier, but also a commendation for ultimately doing the right thing. He was transferred to SEAL Training Command, where he focused on instilling values of respect and accountability in the next generation of operators. His lectures on leadership became legendary for their unflinching honesty about his own failures. As for Jackson Mercer himself, his post-military life unfolded in obscurity. Without the protection of rank or the platform of military service, he became just another disgraced former officer. He moved to a small town in Montana, took a job in his brother-in-law's insurance agency, and largely disappeared from public view. Natasha received one letter from him 6 months after his discharge. It was handwritten, 5 pages of careful script that attempted to articulate an apology for harm that couldn't truly be apologized for. He didn't make excuses or ask for forgiveness. He simply acknowledged that she'd saved his life despite having every reason to let him die, and that this act of grace had forced him to confront everything he'd become. She never responded. Some debts couldn't be repaid with words. The broader military justice system implemented dozens of reforms directly traceable to Natasha's case. The process for appealing court-martial verdicts was strengthened. Independent advocates were assigned to defendants in cases involving senior officer misconduct. Whistleblower protections were expanded and actually enforced. Were the changes perfect? No. The military remained a hierarchical institution resistant to rapid transformation. There were still cases of retaliation, still examples of toxic leaders being protected by networks of complicit officers. But the trajectory had shifted. The institutional tolerance for unchecked abuse had been challenged in ways that created space for future reform. Natasha's research center at Walter Reed became a model for integrating clinical excellence with ethical leadership. The trauma protocol she developed saved an estimated 400 lives in the first year of implementation. Her team pioneered techniques for rapid hemorrhage control, innovative approaches to blast injury treatment, and new models for field surgical intervention. But perhaps her most Important contribution was proving that competence and integrity weren't mutually exclusive, that someone could be both extraordinarily skilled and fundamentally decent. That excellence didn't require cruelty or arrogance. The Hawthorne Foundation, named by Admiral Thornwood before Natasha could object grew into a national organization supporting military personnel who faced professional retaliation. It provided legal assistance, mental health support, career counseling, and advocacy for systemic change. Within 2 years, it had offices in 18 cities and had helped over 800 people navigate circumstances similar to what Natasha had endured. The organization's mission statement, written by Natasha herself, captured the lesson she'd learned through 7 years of exile. Competence cannot be stripped away by courts or tribunals. Integrity cannot be destroyed by manufactured evidence. And truth, though it may be buried for years, always finds its way back to light. As the consequences of her choice rippled outward, Natasha sometimes reflected on the woman she'd been 7 years earlier, naive Commander Reeves, who believed the system would protect those who told the truth. That woman had been destroyed by her own idealism, but from those ashes had emerged someone stronger. Someone who understood that justice wasn't automatic but had to be fought for. That institutional change required both courage and strategy. That the most meaningful victories often came from refusing to become what your enemies expected. The ghost in surgical scrubs had forced a reckoning, not through violence or revenge, but through the simple act of being undeniably competent when it mattered most. And the system that had tried to destroy her had been forced to acknowledge a truth it had spent years trying to bury, that some people's worth transcended rank. That excellence demanded recognition regardless of politics. And that crushing someone for telling the truth ultimately revealed more about the institution than the individual. The reckoning was incomplete, as all human systems remain imperfect. But it was real, and it was permanent. And it would echo forward through every future case where someone had to choose between comfortable silence and dangerous truth. Natasha had made her choice, and the consequences would shape military culture for a generation. People are hungry for this, Natasha replied. They've watched toxic leaders destroy careers for years. Now they finally have tools and institutional support to do something about it. The ceremony began with testimonials from graduates. A Navy nurse described reporting a surgeon who was performing unnecessary procedures to inflate his surgical numbers, something she'd witnessed for months but hadn't reported because previous complaints had resulted in retaliation. The Integrity Officer program had given her the framework and protection to finally act. The surgeon was now under investigation, and 3 patients who'd received unnecessary operations were pursuing legal action. An Army physician detailed exposing a medical supply officer who was diverting medications for personal profit. The scheme had been operating for 18 months, but previous reports had been buried by officers who were part of the network. The Integrity Officer protocols had provided a direct channel to Inspector General, oversight that bypassed compromised command structures. 7 officers were now facing criminal charges. Marine Corpsmen spoke about confronting a commanding officer who routinely belittled enlisted medical personnel and created a climate of fear that compromised patient care. Using techniques learned in the program, he documented the behavior, built a coalition of witnesses, and presented evidence that resulted in the officer's removal from command. The unit's patient safety metrics had improved by 40% within 3 months. Story after story. Each one a small victory against the kind of institutional dysfunction that had once destroyed Natasha's career. Not every case ended in triumph. Some investigations stalled. Some complaints were still buried. Some whistleblowers still faced retaliation despite improved protections. But the trajectory was undeniable. The culture was shifting. After the ceremony, Natasha made her way to the Institute's memorial wall, a permanent installation honoring military medical personnel who'd faced professional retaliation for reporting misconduct. Daniel Ortega's name was there, along with the 3 Marines who died from Hutchins's contaminated medications. But there were others too, dozens of names representing people who'd been destroyed by systems that valued loyalty over truth. She traced Ortega's name with her fingertips, remembering his letter, his trust, his belief that medicine was about being there when it mattered most. "He'd be proud of what you've built here," a voice said behind her. Natasha turned to find Lieutenant Commander Sarah Whitmore, now Commander Whitmore, wearing the rank insignia she'd earned through consistent excellence and ethical leadership. They'd maintained close contact since Forward Sentinel, collaborating on research projects and reform initiatives. "I think he'd be horrified that it was necessary," Natasha replied. "That the system was so broken, it took this much effort to fix." "Fair point," Whitmore conceded. "But he'd still be proud. You didn't just survive what they did to you, you transformed it into something that protects others." They walked together through the Institute's halls, passing classrooms where the next cohort of integrity officers was already beginning their training. The curriculum Natasha had designed combined medical ethics, organizational psychology, legal frameworks, and practical advocacy skills. Students learned to recognize toxic leadership patterns, document misconduct effectively, navigate bureaucratic systems, and protect themselves from retaliation. But perhaps most importantly, they learned that competence and integrity weren't opposing values, that the best physicians were also the most ethical. That excellence in medicine required moral courage as much as technical skill. "I got a letter yesterday," Natasha said as they reached her office. "From Jackson Mercer." Whitmore's eyebrows rose. "Another apology?" "Not exactly." Natasha pulled the letter from her desk drawer. "He's been working with a veterans organization that helps former service members who were discharged under adverse conditions, helping them navigate benefits claims and appeals processes. He says he's trying to understand what it feels like to be on the other side of institutional power. Do you believe him?" Natasha considered the question carefully. "I believe people can change. Whether he has or not isn't really my concern anymore. He lost everything because of his own choices. What he does with that loss is his responsibility, not mine." She'd learned that lesson through years of exile, that she couldn't control what others did or thought, only how she responded. Mercer's redemption or lack thereof wasn't her burden to carry. Her phone buzzed with a message from her research team at Walter Reed. Preliminary results from their latest trauma protocol study showed a 15% improvement in survival rates for penetrating chest injuries. Another incremental victory, another piece of evidence that competence combined with ethical practice saved lives. "I'm heading back to Afghanistan next month," Whitmore said, pulling Natasha's attention back to the present. "Forward Sentinel requested me specifically. They want to implement the full Integrity Officer program and need someone with experience to establish it." "Full circle," Natasha observed. "In a way. But a different circle than when you were there hiding in plain sight." Whitmore's expression grew serious. "Natasha, do you ever regret the years you spent in exile? The time you lost?" The question deserved honest consideration. Natasha thought about the woman she'd been at 29, brilliant, accomplished, naive about how easily excellence could be destroyed by corruption. She thought about the woman she'd become through 7 years of hiding, competent but invisible, skilled but silent, surviving but not truly living. And she thought about who she was now, someone who understood both triumph and defeat, who'd learned that identity transcended rank or recognition, who'd discovered that the deepest victories came not from proving others wrong, but from refusing to become what they expected. "I don't regret the years themselves," she finally answered. "I regret that they were necessary. That the system was so broken, it required 7 years of exile to teach me lessons I should have learned differently. But the woman who emerged from those years is stronger than the woman who went in." So no, I don't regret who I became, even if I regret the circumstances that shaped me. That evening, Natasha stood on the balcony of her Walter Reed office, watching the sun set over Washington, D.C. The city was beautiful from this height, monuments and memorials, symbols of ideals that institutions often failed to live up to. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize with an Afghan country code. Dr. Reeves, she answered. Ma'am, this is Petty Officer First Class Amanda Chun, calling from Forward Sentinel. The voice was young, female, nervous. I'm a corpsman stationed here, and I'm facing a situation I don't know how to handle. My supervising physician there are patient safety issues, ma'am. Serious ones. But he's connected to senior officers, and I'm just enlisted, and I don't know what to do. Natasha felt something click into place, the reason all of this mattered. The purpose that had emerged from 7 years of suffering. Tell me everything, she said. And then I'm going to tell you exactly what resources you have, what protections are in place, and how to report this safely. You're not alone, Petty Officer Chun. Not anymore. She spent the next hour walking Chun through the integrity officer protocols, connecting her with advocates who could help, ensuring she understood that speaking up didn't mean sacrificing her career. By the end of the call, Chun's voice had shifted from terrified to determined. After they hung up, Natasha updated Chun's information in the Hawthorne Foundation database. One more person protected by systems that hadn't existed when Natasha needed them most. She thought about the letter she'd written 3 years ago, the one she'd left in her lockbox at Forward Sentinel for whoever might need it. Amanda Rodriguez, the young maintenance trainee who'd found it, had completed medical training and was now studying to become a physician assistant. She'd credited Natasha's letter with giving her courage to pursue medicine, despite being told she wasn't officer material. The ripples continued spreading outward. Over the following months, Natasha maintained her position at Walter Reed while expanding the Integrity Officer program to all service branches. The Trauma Research Center she directed produced breakthrough after breakthrough, new protocols that saved lives, innovative techniques that reduced disability, training programs that raised the baseline competence of military medicine globally. But her most important work remained the advocacy, the late-night calls from terrified whistleblowers, the testimony before congressional committees, the quiet meetings with senior officers who were finally ready to acknowledge that protecting toxic leaders had always been more expensive than removing them. She received an invitation to speak at the Naval Academy about ethical leadership. Standing before 1,000 midshipmen, she told her story without embellishment or drama. The betrayal, the exile, the choice to save a man's life despite everything he'd done, the decision to transform personal suffering into institutional change. Excellence without integrity is ultimately hollow, she told them. And integrity without competence is equally insufficient. The military needs both, needs you to be both. The best version of leadership isn't choosing between being skilled and being decent. It's refusing to accept that those are separate things. The questions afterward were pointed and thoughtful. One midshipman asked, "Ma'am, if you could go back and prevent what happened to you, would you?" Natasha considered this carefully. "If I could prevent Gerald Hutchins from becoming corrupt, prevent the 3 Marines from dying, prevent all the suffering his network caused, yes, absolutely. But if the question is whether I'd trade the person I've become for a version of myself who never faced that crucible, no, the woman I was before wouldn't have built this." She gestured to encompass not just the auditorium, but everything the past 3 years had created. Sometimes we learn the most important lessons through the hardest experiences. The key is using those lessons to prevent others from needing to learn them the same way. As the years continued unfolding, Natasha watched the culture shift in ways both subtle and profound. Toxic leaders still existed, but they faced scrutiny they'd never encountered before. Whistleblowers still took risks, but they had protections and support that made those risks more manageable. The military remained hierarchical and resistant to change, but the trajectory had altered. She promoted young physicians who embodied both excellence and ethics. She mentored enlisted medical personnel who'd been told they weren't capable of advancement. She collaborated with congressional oversight committees to strengthen protections and close loopholes. She published research that saved lives while also publishing advocacy pieces that challenged institutional dysfunction, and late at night. When the work was done and the office was quiet, she sometimes opened the lockbox she'd kept from Forward Sentinel and reread Daniel Ortega's letter. His words remained true. Medicine wasn't about glory. It was about being there when it mattered most. She'd been there when Jackson Mercer needed her, despite everything he'd done. She'd been there when Amanda Chun called from Afghanistan, terrified and alone. She was there every day for the people who needed proof that competence and integrity could coexist. That speaking truth didn't mean career suicide. That the system could be changed by people who refused to accept its BROKENNES. Dr. Natasha Reeves had spent 7 years as a ghost in surgical scrubs, hiding from a past that had destroyed her. But she'd emerged from those shadows, not as the naive commander she'd once been, nor as the invisible technician she pretended to be. She'd emerged as something new, someone forged by both triumph and trauma, shaped by both competence and humility, defined by both excellence and integrity. The military hadn't given her that identity. She'd claimed it herself, through the simple revolutionary act of being undeniably good at what she did while refusing to compromise who she was, and every life saved through the protocol she developed. Every whistleblower protected by systems she helped create. Every toxic leader held accountable under reforms she championed. Each one was proof that the ghost in surgical scrubs had become something far more powerful than any rank or recognition could convey. She'd become the change she'd needed 7 years earlier. And that legacy would outlive any title, any commendation, any institutional acknowledgement, because true redemption wasn't about being restored to who you were before. It was about becoming someone who ensured others never had to suffer what you endured. And Natasha Reeves, standing in her office overlooking a city full of monuments to imperfect ideals, had finally found peace in knowing she'd done exactly that. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.